Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to be here in what is a social or symbolic capital city of note, compared to the farm where I grew up, farming with sheep in the semi-desert area. So it's great for me to be here, and allow me to add my thanks to and acknowledgement to the speakers that came before me, for the Nida Institute for inviting me, specifically for James, who communicated with me and who was very friendly and hospitable in the invitation, and to Deborah. What happened to there? Yes. So she helped me out a lot with questions about the procedure and what's going to happen and so on, supporting me with that. Thanks a lot. Brian Park and Michael. Brian with a lot of technical stuff about payments and hotels and all those kinds of things, which is quite scary if you come to New York. So thanks for that. And which is equally scary is technology. And to have Michael covering, it's great. Thanks for that. I would also specifically like to thank David and Maria and Salah for, I had to send on some reading work for them, I assume, having done the homework. I'll ask some questions and test them on that as time goes on today. But it's an honor that people read the stuff and are willing to respond and are willing to engage on the topic. Right, so I'm going to move ahead. I have two apologies that I need to point out. The first one is that, and specifically that's for the respondents also, in one of my papers I said that I plan on having an electronic three-dimensional model of some of my thinking. The person I contracted to do this dropped me solidly. So you have a little drawn picture in my personal Picasso-like style, which I will show it to you. The other thing is that at 2 points, my PowerPoint started acting up yesterday. And rather than try to do a whole new PowerPoint, which might be even more screwed up, I just have to move one or two keys back and forward, but hopefully we'll get there. So it won't be as smooth as I wanted it, but we should be able to get through this. Right. So by way of introduction, I think one can say that complexity, let me just use the word generally, complexity has been in the making for about 150 years, depending on who you ask. And also depending on who you ask, there would have been 3 or 4 waves of the complexity thinking, with mainly sort of the 1920s, 30s, 40s as the first line of thinking on emergence. Then the chaos theory of the 1980s with the butterfly effect that most people will know about, which I will get back to briefly. And then since the 1990s, roughly, complex adaptive systems theory, which is where we are currently at. I searched at the UMass Library last week. I did a search with complexity as a hit, and I found 1,745 titles for complexity in the title, and about 800 of those since 2010. So you can see that there's a definite increase in publications, and these cover anything from physics, mathematics, sociology to humanities, theology. So it's quite a wide field. And as a last point of introduction, I think I want to clarify that you would find in the literature roughly 3 ways of referring to complexity, which would be complexity theory, or complexity thinking, or complexity philosophy. So complexity theory would basically refer to the more quantitative natural sciences approaches to complexity. And that's actually where complexity thinking arose in physics and in biology. On the sort of other side, you would find complexity philosophy. That would be people like Edgar Morin, and there was a South African Paul Sillier, who were philosophers, and they used complexity as a philosophical notion and philosophized about this without any technical, empirical work applied to it. And then sort of halfway in the middle, but this is very generalized, you would find complexity thinking, I think, which would be, I think, what we are trying to do, what I'm trying to do today. So I sure draw from complexity theory, but not being a natural scientist, not being versed in computation and mathematical work, I cannot really engage with that, especially with the empirical work from that. So it's more, what we're trying to do, I think, is think about what the implications of complexity theory and complexity philosophy together would be for the humanities thinking. Right. So what I'm going to try to do today is first to give you an overview of complexity, and I want to point out that that will be roughly exploratory. In other words, exploring a number of concepts, and descriptive, trying to explain to you what these concepts are, but I don't want to take the road into explanatory thinking about complexity in explaining why things are complex, because that will take us into deep physics and deep philosophy, which I don't understand fully in the first place, and which I don't think is relevant for what we want to achieve. Secondly, I'm going to present the Picasso part, modeling the complexity of interlingual translation, and then I will explore something about the complexity of intersemiotic translation. The latter two parts will be sort of more applied parts that would also, that you could use in your research problem. Right, so I'm moving on. So the first feature, I think, of complexity is that it is an effort to non-reductionist thinking. So reductionism, roughly explained, means that you try to understand something by reducing it to its parts or to simpler forms. And the assumption is then, once you understand the simpler forms, you will understand the more complex. So if you want to understand what a human being is, you study the genetics, or you study the cell and the biochemistry of the cell. And by that, you then assume that you are able to explain what a human being is. It works on the assumption that parts can explain the whole. And much of the success and the huge successes, I mean, the city of New York is testimony to that, of natural sciences, mathematical sciences, engineering sciences, is built on this principle, which is a valid principle, that you can reduce phenomena, and by reducing them, you can understand them and you can control them. It also operates on the assumption, most probably best exemplified by Newton, his laws of physics, that very complex phenomena like the universe can explain by very simple laws, like the first law of motion, or the law of electromagnetism, or the law of, what's it when something falls? Gravity, the laws of gravity. Right. So you would have a very simple law of gravity, which will explain why all the planets move around all the suns, and all the suns move around any kind of center, or whichever way you want to explain your ontology. So the idea is that reality might seem complex, but actually there are very simple laws underlying it. That would be a reductionist view. Now, the problem with reductionism can best be explained by playing pool. So once you have two balls left, one being the white ball with which you shoot, and the other one being the black ball, and if you know the size of the table, which is the initiating conditions, you know the surface, you know the velocity with which you're going to hit the ball, and you know the angles, you can pretty much predict for as long into future as you want to where the black ball will be. That is a typical linear logic argument that works if you have 2 balls. The moment you have 3 balls, that ability, that linear reductionist ability falls away for reasons which I cannot explain to you, and I don't think anybody can. It's just a fact of life. It boils down to the complexity of effects, causes and effects. So, and we cannot work that out. The same kind of problem would be that even if you can do a full chemical analysis of a human being, you won't be able to say that much about their culture. It might tell you some things about what they ate and where they lived and the kind of smog they inhaled and so on, which you might be able to tell about their culture, but you won't be able to tell everything from a chemical analysis. So, meaning that the parts don't tell you everything about larger wholes or larger configurations. So the conclusion then that complexity comes to is that not everything can be explained by reduction. A number of things can, and it can be very successful, but not everything can be explained. Not even all physical things, like the weather, cannot fully be explained by reduction. To a limited extent it can, but not fully. The second feature of complexity, I think, is nonlinearity, where linearity would basically mean something like if you have, and I've used the example of 11 bricks. If you have 11 bricks, you can add their weight, divide by 11, get the average brick, and then predict what 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 bricks would weigh. That's typical linear ways of thinking. But if you marry 2 people, you can't predict what the outcome would be because the interaction is not linear, right? So linearity is linear logic, the logic of one cause directly having one effect which is predictable, works for an engineering paradigm, some of the natural science paradigms, to some extent for some humanities things if you average out a lot of differences, but it doesn't work in all cases. Right. So in complex systems, the cause and effect relationships are then nonlinear. So what that would mean that you would have lots of causes having one effect, or one cause having lots of effects, or the same cause having different effects in different contexts, because there are different constraining factors, or what you quite often have in complex systems like brains and culture is you would have effects working on effects. So you get a sort of a multiplicity effect, and it pans out in a way that you cannot exactly predict. So this would be typical in living organisms, and Maria will most probably talk about this in detail in brains, where the complex interactions are just too complex to predict linearly, right? And in the case of Bible translation in culture, you would have the same Bible translation, and if you put that Bible in America and if you put that Bible in Cameroon, you would have different social effects. So there's no linearity there. The third feature would be what is called emergence. Now, emergence is commonly known by the saying that the whole is more than the parts, right? We all use this all the time. But if you want to think in a more clear way about emergence, the problem is, so what is the more and where does it come from? What causes this more? And I'm not going to go into that. I'm leaving a bit of an answer for later. But that's one of the problems that complexity thinkers are battling with. On a certain level, one could say that the more comes from organization and relationships. So if you have an atom of hydrogen and you have H2. So 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen, and you add them together, or they are added together, they are still the same atom of hydrogen and the atom of oxygen. But because they are now organized differently and in a new relationship to one another, they have the features of water. They don't stop being oxygen and hydrogen. So the material substrate stays the same, but the characteristics or the features of the phenomena takes on different forms, like water. So the organization and the relationships between things or phenomena is part of where the more comes from. But the more also comes from constraints. And this is the part that I will leave for the next slide, where I will deal a bit more with, in detail with constraints. The important thing for emergence is that there's no little man somewhere, either in the brain or in culture or in politics or in the economy. There's no central control that regulates this. So in popular parlance, I mean, there are various ways of looking at this, but the popular way of looking is saying that the system self-organizes. And it, once again, organizes itself under particular physical constraints, which makes it organized. And therefore, all these self-organizing systems take particular patterns. They don't emerge fully chaotically. They emerge in trends and in trajectories with patterns. When we think about emergence, there are usually 2 terms that are used, and that is upward causation and downward causation. So upward causation would be the typical one where we say that the parts and the way that they are organized cause the whole. So from the bottom up, from more specific to more general, right? The other way would be to say that the whole has some downward causation on the parts. That would be like Durkheim claiming that society as a whole cause certain patterns in human beings. That would be a typically downward causative argument. I will get back to this also in a moment. I'm just pointing it out that this is the point that I wanted to make. Right. So complexity also assumes that reality is hierarchically or ordered. Now, I'm going to skip over this quickly on the one hand because it's not that important, but this has to deal with the whole question of dualism or monism or materialism or a complex view of reality. The important thing is that complexity thinkers are trying to present something like a unificatory model of reality, where levels of reality are embedded in one another, are interpenetrable, and emerge out of one another. Now, what I've given you there is one of the views that one can have, where the physical world is, or physical reality is the most basic. Out of that emerges chemical reality. Out of that emerges biological reality. And then after that, we're not really sure. I've put in here semiotic reality. In other words, ideas that come out of that, thoughts, consciousness. That's a whole open debate. But what basically happens is that between these levels, as it were, you have what the physicists call phase transitions. So a phase transition would be like when ice turns into water. It's the same material substratum, but their relationships are different. They turn into a different phase of that thing. So all chemical phenomena are also physical. All biological phenomena have to be chemical and physical. So they're embedded in one another. Right. So if you think in terms of hierarchical ordering, it becomes tempting to think that everything is related to everything, which theoretically it is. But when you observe and when you have to study this, sort of the convention in complexity thinking is that you observe at 3 levels. So you choose a level of observation, and then you posit a next lower level and a next higher level, and they are related. And out of the interaction between those 3 levels, you find the emergence of new phenomena. Complex systems are also sensitive to initial conditions. We know that, for instance, by the butterfly effect, where a small change in the beginning of a system can have huge effects at the end of it. The same with mob behavior. Somebody can just cough in a mob. Somebody thinks it was a swear word, and the mob erupts. Right? So it's sensitivity to initial conditions means that you have that small changes at the beginning of a process in a system can have huge and usually unpredictable effects. Right. I'm running a bit deep into my time. You can go and Google Per Buck. He won the Nobel Prize for physics with a very simple but an extremely deep experiment of sand piles, where he could prove that by adding 1 grain of sand each time, so you're not actually changing much. Sometimes you get huge little avalanches on the sand pile, and sometimes you get virtually nothing. So that unpredictability and sensitivity is the implications for us is that complex systems are to a large extent unpredictable. I'm not claiming absolute unpredictability, but to a large extent. For example, if you gave 2 people 10,000 Rand today, nobody would predict their profit in 10 years. The system is too open to be able to do that. So then the question is, why doesn't everything happen that can happen? And that is because of attractors. So any system starts out with an open number of possibilities. When you start out, anything can happen relatively to that system. But attractors mean that things tend to happen and tend to stabilize around a particular point. Right? So let's assume a landscape with different heights, and it rains 1 inch everywhere. So attractors would mean that the basin of that landscape would be the tendency to which the water flows. Not all water will flow there. Some will stay on top, some will seep into the ground, but most of it will tend to go there. So a basin in a landscape would be an attractor for the water. The interesting thing is that these attractors cause trajectories. In other words, cause tendencies which then reinforce one another by the constraints that are being formed. So what you would have is the water flowing in the basin of the river, in the basin of the landscape, would eventually carve out a river, which means that the water won't flow generally in the basis anymore, but specifically in the river. And if there's not much water, it will even in the river itself carve out a more narrow path that it will follow. So in this way, attractors are, these tendencies are causing patterns to emerge. And I think the interesting thing that I'm after is how these work with semiosis, with meaning-making processes. And this means, as Terence Deacon rightly or wrongly claims, that the whole is less than the parts, not more, as complexity thinking say, because a whole means that a number of realities have not realized. A number of possibilities have not been realized. So there are fewer possibilities in a whole than there are in the parts, right? So a whole is always to an extent constrained. A text, for instance, let's say a biblical text, is less complex than the biblical world out of which that arrived or arisen, because it has been constrained materially, it has been constrained in terms of streams of meaning. So constraints What does the more mean in the whole is more than the parts? The problem with constraints is that upward causation is fine, we can understand that. Downward causation causes a problem of circular argument, because you're arguing that the same parts that cause the whole are now causing the parts. And that becomes circular argument. There's also a problem that two things with the same parts cannot be different in physical argument. So if you have exactly the same number of atoms in two things, they have to be the same things. And if, so you cannot have different parts, the same parts leading to different phenomena. So what Terence Deacon once again did is to say that, well, the top-down causality should not be seen as the whole that causes the parts, but the constraints on the whole that cause the parts. So what he would want us to imagine is that certain things that did not happen, that did not take effect, by the fact that they did not happen, certain other things happened. And therefore you have causative effect by things that did not happen. So think quickly about a farmer buying 5 hectares of land, or acres, I don't know what you call it here. When he buys that, there are X number of possible things he can do it. The moment he plows that land and puts in corn, Y number of things cannot happen anymore on that piece of land. So the things that did not happen are the things that constrain and, in his terms, cause and have causal effect on the things that can happen. So once again, what seems to happen here is that patterns emerge through the causative power of things that did not happen, that could have happened, but did not. And these constraints and systems are recursive, and they're mutually influencing one another. Right. So now I quickly want to explain to you some of my ideas on interlingual translation, what we could use from complexity thinking about interlingual translation. I define translation at this point as a technical term to refer to the process by which meaning is created, and I base my argument on Peirce, and I'm not going to go into detail into that. The important thing that I want to point out is that this process is, because of the nature of the process, is indeterminate and it's vague. That's the nature of semiosis, right? And it will render neither identical signs nor absolutely new signs. So the emergence of semiotic patterns will always be somewhat identical and somewhat different. Semiotically, theoretically, you cannot have two identical copies, if for the only reason that the one was made half a second after the other. But time has changed the one into a later copy. So they're not, in that sense, they're not identical. So what I think we need to explain is the patterns that these semiotic processes take, rather than the other way around. So I'm not assuming a constant and see how translation changes the constant. I'm assuming a process and seeing how translation constrains patterns and make the process somewhat more constrained and somewhat more stable. Right. So, and this is where I need to make my move and hopefully do this. Right. This is my Picasso. Right? It's up for sale. Bid started at $100 million American dollars. Right. I have to move here to explain some of the things. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm using fluid mechanics as a model for the translation process. So this is a river, this is a stream, top view. Oh. forgot about it. It's okay. Thanks. So you have a stream flowing from left to right. It could be right to left. What I'm trying to represent with the stream is time, the flow in time. So for me, translation is not a flow in space in the first place, but a flow in time. It could also flow in space, but it's flow in time. And what I cannot represent here is recursivity and feedback. So, but for the moment, we assume that it's there. What I further wanted to represent here is the rhizomatic multiple stream nature of semiotics, or semiosis, of all streams of meaning. So meaning is not a singular thing. It's a complex array of ideas, of streams flowing. Because I want to focus on time, and what I've done here is I've created two little eddies. These patterns are eddies. And this would be in terms that you are aware of the source text and the target text. To represent something about the time, the flow of time, I'm calling the first text an incipient sign system. So it's just starting. And in another observation, this incipient sign system could be a subsequent one, right? And it usually is. And in the same way, the subsequent sign system in another observation could be an incipient one. So they are just incipient and subsequent relative to each other and to the observation that you want to make. The important point, I think, is that these patterns are simultaneously processes, right? They're not stable things. They just the pattern that the process takes at that time. And they can be variously constrained from spoken language, which is gone in a moment, to cuneiform texts on rock, or written books, or so that materially they can be variously constrained and have various forms of permanence. But the point is that they are what they are because they were constraints on meaning patterns, right? The other thing I wanted to illustrate is the various streams or strains that you can think of here. So I took the little nursery rhyme, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and I said, okay, one of the semiotic streams could be about a star. So you can see, sort of showing it, the star idea coming in, part of the source, the incipient sign system, going through part of the subsequent sign system, and after that, what happens with it. The sky, up above the sky, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. So there it goes, into the incipient system, through into the subsequent system. But I could, for some reason, be religious and take a notion of God that I want to include in this translation. And you see I've colored it blue here, and it passes by the incipient system. It's not part of the incipient system. It never was. But it goes into the subsequent system, right? Or there could be, I think it was, which one was it? There was another one. Let's say the rhyme. I want to translate it into Afrikaans, my home language. Rhyme doesn't work, so the rhyme was part of the incipient system, but it passes by. It doesn't go into the subsequent system. So with that, I think when we look at this kind of process, there's nothing in the process itself that says, that prescribes how this process should go. What we know is that it moves in time, and that it's complex, and that the process, the constraints under which it takes place, and the sort of the banks of the river would be your constraints. Constrains what happens. So it's not in language itself well, not only in language itself, or not only in semiosis itself that the constraints are located. The constraints are also located in how the process plays out in time. So it's radically historical, and it's of a process nature. So you could even have systems of meaning that obviously that misses both of these. I mean, a text is not about everything. There are lots that are not in that little text. Then just quickly, so that was the one thing that I wanted to illustrate, the process nature of interlingual, in this case we're talking in the interlingual translation. Secondly, I think I wanted quickly to illustrate one or two things about levels, the levels of observation. So for this level of observation, this is the incipient sign system, and that's a subsequent sign system. As I said, this could differ. For this particular observation, things like rhyme, rhythm, words like star would be the next lower level, and your banks of your river, the next higher level, would be things like genre, the social, political, economic conditions in which the translation takes place. So what you then have is that a pattern of constraints, the source text emerges as a pattern of constraints, the incipient text, which constrains the reading. And please hear me clearly, I'm not saying determine, I'm saying constrains. Right? Determines is way too strong. It constrains the subsequent text, which then again constrains subsequent text, and obviously with some feedback in. So that sort of rules out that a text can mean everything. It most probably can mean anything, but it can't mean everything, because it's a pattern of constraints. And therefore there are some limitations. If there are no pattern, then you have no text, zero translation, no process. And I could illustrate, I mean, you can think of lots of examples. Count of Monte Cristo that Caroline spoke about at our complexity conference, from quite literal interlingual translations to Japanese manga with no relationship to the novel, but called the Count of Monte Cristo. So that would still be one of these little streams have gone through into the title of the Count of Monte Cristo. But a lot of other ones have bypassed, in that case, the incipient system and have been included in the subsequent system. And that is the nature of semiotic process. Okay, so that is as far as the interlingual translation is concerned. Just want to switch. I think 10 or 15 minutes that are left. Explain a bit of a qualitative method for intersemiotic translation. I think one of the main issues with complexity thinking and humanity is qualitative methods. We had the conference in June looking at this specifically. We'll hopefully publish a book next year with a number of chapters. But what has actually been quantitative methods in the development of complexity thinking and theory, we now have to find ways to say, how can we make them qualitative? So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to combine narrative theory and possible worlds theory. And why am I doing this? Narrative theory, it gives us a way of conceptualizing process, complex processes. So you have the interaction between time, space, events, or causality, and people, or actors, actants in the semiotic theory, which gives you a complex representation of the reality that you want to map, right? So that will give you covering the process side, which you can then do qualitatively with narrative. Possible worlds theory or counterfactual theory gives you the ability to think that I can tell the story like this, or I can tell it like this, or I can tell it like that. And then I can compare the possibilities of the, or the plausibilities of the various narratives that I construct, and come to some kind of judgment about the probability of the logic of my argument. And I will try to demonstrate that with a bit of data for you. So I said that. So what I'm essentially here looking for is the interplay between attractors and constraints. Right. So the example that I want to give to you is the example of a Scottish young man who at the age of 10 in 1850 came to South Africa with his parents. And here I just quickly need to show you where he came to. Where is my, let me just do it this way. I'm just going to do it this way. So this is the map of South Africa, right? Those of you who know a bit about South Africa, this is Cape Town, there's Johannesburg, and there's Durban on the East Coast. So Donald Strachan and his mom and dad and his brother, older brother, landed in Durban with a ship in 1850. In 1851, his mom died, and in 1852, his dad died. So the two brothers at that point, age 12 and 14 roughly, were left here without parents. They befriended a Zulu transport driver, Simon Gadebe. And Simon took them on as hands to work on his transport wagons, and he learned the language, Zulu. He later learned Sotho, Xhosa, and Afrikaans, and obviously knew English. And he learned the business of transport riding, and he learned to do business. Right. So what they did is they had a business, a transport route straight to the east here. Now, the English were in charge of Durban. The Zulus were in charge of this area to the inland. The Xhosas were in charge of this area. The Sotho is here where the Sothos were. The Afrikaans, old Transvaal Republic was here. And just here was an area called No Man's Land. Not because nobody lived there, but because it was under nobody's control. It was too far away from Cape Town and too far away from Durban for the English to control. And what had happened is just in the years before that, the Griqua people, who was a mixed race group of people coming from slave ancestry, moved from here across the mountains and settled here and formed their own republic, even had their own print money. They were Afrikaans speaking, right? And the English told them from the Cape, you can govern this area as long as you keep the Zulus and the Xhosas and the Sothos out of each other's hair. Right. And into this fray, Donald Strachan came. He later became known, as you will see in my topic, as Madonnala, which is a Sotho Zuluized version of Donald, his name. And he became a businessman, politician, and interpreter for the Griqua group of people here. And the Griquas could keep their independence as long as they kept the peace. And he was instrumental in that, not only interpreting in meetings, which he did, but also being an envoy and being able to do that in the local languages. Right. So if we look at right. So I have three questions about after what happened this week in your country. I'm afraid to say this guy. I'll rather talk about this person, right? Donald, right? So the questions would be, I think, when we want to understand the role that translation plays in the emergence of society. These should be questions such as, which social attractors which cause Madonnala's life to gravitate towards a particular trajectory can be identified? And how did the social system into which he stepped play a role? And how did his life trajectory play a role in this? And I want to show you one or two things that I did with this. So firstly, I think it seems logical that the fact that he moved to South Africa was a major causal factor in the fact that he became an interpreter and that he had a role in society. And we can then tell the story. We can explore why he came, what the economic conditions were in Scotland. They were relatively poor, economic conditions were bad, the colonies were options for them to go to, and counterfactual, had they stayed in Scotland, he would not have played this role. Very simple argument at this level, I think, and we can then say, okay, we can conclude that the move to South Africa, we've tested that, it can hold. But then we can ask the question, so the role of the death of his parents, had both or one of his parents lived to an old age, would that have played a different role? And I think one can argue, yes. Coming into a foreign country, having only these people to depend on, you would have stayed together as a family. Especially had the dad died, they would have been responsible for their mum, and they would have most probably had to look after. There were no old age homes, so we can build up all kinds of counterfactuals, had this, had that happened, and then we can come to the conclusion, well, most probably the fact that his parents died also opened him up for dependence on other cultures. The Hadebe guy that took them in, had they have a strong social bond, he would most probably not have went on the transport road with these guys, or become immersed in Zulu culture as he did, because he was fluent. So let's look at his personal life. If he had no linguistic ability, because he was gifted, he spoke 5, 6 languages. Let's say, for some reason, he couldn't pick up those languages. I think we can argue that he may have played still a political role, but not through the medium of interpreting and translation. Right? He became financially hugely successful, which is a whole nother story. But we can ask the same question. Let's say he knew 7 languages, but he was as poor as dirt, and he lived in a little shack. Nobody would have known him. Nobody would have asked him to intervene politically. So for the linguistic ability to work, you also had the financial success to work. So can you see that you already have complex causal factors that all somehow need to work together for some social effect to emerge? The same with political ability. Even you get very rich people with lots of linguistic ability, but let's say he was a reclusive. He stayed in his fancy study and read books all the day, like the likes of us, you know? If he had no political ability and no political standing, once again, his role as an interventor, as an agent of translation would not have been possible. I'm going to skip over the next part just to close with the last one. And that is, there are interesting questions for which I have no final answers because data is scant, but the question becomes, in South Africa, given its racial division, which was already in the 1850s significant, his lack of cultural center, his lack of a family center, his lack of a linguistic center, he could move around with all these languages. How did that play a role in the emergence in that no man's land of the only true non-racial republic that South Africa has ever had? Because that Griqua Republic was made up of mixed race, Sotho people, white people, black. It was totally a mixed race republic for the 20 years that it lasted. So once again, now here it becomes more tricky. And what I want to point out with this is not that I have an answer, but that I think complexity thinking could help us not to get quick answers to these kinds of questions. Because I see quite often in sociological studies of translation that because there was intent, we also immediately argue that there was effect. We can demonstrate cause. Somebody wanted to change Turkey politically and started doing translations. But can we argue that that affected a change? And I think that's a much more difficult social construct to make. And I think this kind of counterfactual. So we could argue that, yes, Madonna was sort of culturally uncentered, but the Griquas themselves, being of mixed race, mixed language, frontier political people could have caused this. And that becomes then interesting to say, but okay, how do societies emerge and where do these multicultural kind of societies emerge through what kinds of translations? Okay, I think my time is roughly up. Do I have 5 more minutes? Right. Okay, so just some conclusions. So I want to make it clear that I don't think kind of arguments, but it will definitely not solve, I think, all arguments. I think what it's reminding us of all the time is that causality is not singular in complex systems. There might be singular complexity in singular causality in certain systems, but in complex adaptive systems, it's multiple and it's complex. I hope that this kind of thinking, and I had to go quite quickly over a large amount of stuff, but it could give us at least more nuanced, maybe more rigorous, I'm not sure, but at least more nuanced conceptual tools to argue for the role of translation in the emergence of social patterns and social forms. I think it challenges us to at least augment substantial thinking with relational process thinking. So in translation studies, not necessarily everywhere, but it's significant still that we have sort of the view of a text and the text or aspects of it translated into another text. I think if we can think about flows and processes and of the forms that we observe as temporary under constraints and try to explain those constraints. So we need not to explain why things are relative and why they are moving about. We need to explain why they take form and what are the forces and the constraints politically, economically, socially that cause them to take those forms. So what needs to explain are the patterns and the constraints. I think process thinking in this complex way leads to radical historicity, that things are the way they are in the moment that they are such, and that doesn't mean forever. And this is something that I'm sort of playing with a bit, the idea of what do we translate? And I would suggest at least one way of looking at it, not the only way and not the last way, final way, but would be that we are translating patterns of meaning that have been materialized in particular ways, patterns of meaning that have immersed through particular constraints, and that we actually looking at patterns of constraint or patterns that are caused by constraint, and this interplay between parts and wholes, if you want to call it that, between process and the constraints on that process. And if we can maybe direct our attention to there, we might see things which we haven't seen before. Thank you.